In the earliest chapters of his life, Robert Redford survived heartbreaks that would have shattered most men, trials that carved into him, redirected his life, and shaped a performer unlike any of his generation. What the world never realized is that the sorrow you saw in his eyes came from a pain that wasn't scripted. It was his own. Robert Redford's story doesn't open with bright lights or red carpets. It opens decades before the world called him a film legend, back in the sun-drenched post-depression streets of Santa Monica. The air smelled of salt from the nearby Pacific, and the neighborhood still carried the optimism of a nation rising from hard economic times. In those childhood streets, little Robert, or Bobby, as the neighbors called him, could often be seen sprinting down the sidewalks, a baseball glove worn almost to threads, hair wind-tossed, grin wide and careless. He was a California boy in every way, competitive, agile, sun-kissed, endlessly curious. Yet even in those early years, something in him was different. Teachers described him as restless, not the kind of restlessness born from misbehavior, but from a mind that didn't want to sit still. He needed to move, to explore, to test boundaries. He was the kind of kid who climbed a fence just because it was there, who wandered farther than he was allowed just to see what waited around the corner. To anyone watching, Bobby Redford looked like the kind of child for whom the world would always make room. But life had already marked him for a different kind of education. Because beneath all that brightness, the shadows were already forming. In the early 1950s, the word polio hung over American households like a ghost. Parents whispered about it over dinner tables, newspapers printed frightening statistics, and playgrounds grew quiet during outbreaks. It was the illness everyone feared but few understood, a condition that could take a child's strength or even their life in a matter of days. For 11-year-old Robert Redford, that fear became real. One summer afternoon, instead of racing outside with neighborhood kids, he found himself fighting a strange weakness in his limbs. A fatigue he didn't recognize, a fever that lingered too long. The diagnosis came quickly, a mild case of polio. For a boy who had lived entirely in movement, the sudden fragility was earth-shaking. The world seemed to shrink to the size of his bedroom. The walls that once held posters of baseball heroes now held silence. The glove that had molded perfectly to his hand sat unused on a shelf. His friends played outside while he recovered, their voices muffled behind the thin window glass. It wasn't a life-threatening case, and he would recover fully. But that summer carved something into him, an understanding that the human body, even one as energetic and athletic as his, was not unbreakable. Children aren't supposed to learn fragility that young. But Robert did. That brush with illness planted the seed of a truth he wouldn't articulate until adulthood. Strength and vulnerability are never far apart. That lesson, quietly absorbed at 11, would shape the man he became. The films he chose, the characters he portrayed, men who often wore confidence like armor, while carrying fractures beneath the surface. Polio did not defeat him, but it did introduce him to his first great shadow. If the polio summer taught him vulnerability, the next tragedy taught him silence. Before Robert Redford became the only child everyone recognized, he was not alone. He was born a twin brother to two infant sisters, girls who lived only a short time. Their deaths, heartbreakingly early, left his parents with a grief too deep and too painful to touch. In those days, families often coped with tragedy by burying it, emotionally and sometimes literally. Mental health awareness was decades away. Therapy was considered taboo in many households, and public displays of emotion were seen as weakness rather than release. So the Redford household did what many families of that era did. They survived by not speaking. The absence of his sisters lived in the quiet places of the home, the corners where his mother sometimes paused longer than necessary, the heaviness in his father's voice when he spoke about the past, the unspoken tension that came from loving a child fiercely because losing two others had nearly broken them. Robert didn't fully understand what had happened. How could he? He was just a boy, but children feel what adults don't say. He sensed the weight behind his mother's eyes. He felt the carefulness in his father's affection, the way every hug held a little fear. And so, without being told, he learned a lesson carried by many children of loss. Some pain lives in silence. Some grief becomes part of the wallpaper of a home. And some wounds are inherited even when you never saw them happen. This was the second shadow, the one deeper than illness. This was the beginning of an emotional education far beyond his years. To understand Robert Redford's early life, you have to understand the era. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the idea of talking about your feelings wasn't simply discouraged, it was almost unimaginable. Fathers especially were defined by stoicism. Strength meant composure, emotion meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was to be avoided at all costs. Robert's father, Charles, was everything American masculinity demanded then: hardworking, responsible, loyal to his family, committed to doing whatever it took to put food on the table. But life had given him wounds he didn't know how to share. Losing his daughters carved something into him, a quietness, a careful distance, the kind a man carries when he fears loving something too much. His mother, Martha, had dreams of her own, dreams of art, music, expression. In a different era, she might have pursued them. But women's ambitions in the mid-20th century were often confined within the walls of their homes. She poured her hopes into her surviving son. She loved him fiercely, protectively, almost desperately. But love like that can carry shadows of its own. Robert grew up sensing he was treasured not only for who he was, but for who was lost before him. And when love is mixed with loss, it becomes complicated, even for a child. So he learned an unspoken household rule. Pretend everything is fine. Pretend the illness didn't scare him. Pretend his mother's sadness was invisible. Pretend the missing sisters weren't missing. Pretend, pretend, pretend. These early emotional rehearsals, this quiet masking, would later become an unintentional training ground for the craft he mastered as an adult, performing. He learned to act long before a camera ever rolled. Even with the grief and silence, childhood still gave him moments of wild freedom. The sunlit California streets were his refuge. He rode his bike faster than he should have, scraped his knees more than a dozen times, climbed trees that weren't meant to be climbed. His restlessness wasn't rebellion, it was survival, a way to get out of the house and breathe. Friends remembered him as the kid who always pushed the limit just a little. He'd leap from rocks into the surf without hesitation. He'd disappear on long exploratory walks. He'd test every rule not to break it, but to understand it. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was trying to outrun the shadows that followed him. Adventure, even the small kind, gave him something he didn't have at home. A feeling of control. If he pedaled fast enough, if he climbed high enough, if he ran far enough, maybe the heaviness that filled the house would stay behind. And though he didn't know it then, this hunger for motion, for exploration, for escaping the expected, would one day become one of the defining elements of his artistry. When he ultimately became a filmmaker, his characters were often wanderers, men who ran from something or toward something. Men seeking freedom, identity, redemption. Men who resembled the boy he once was. One of the greatest paradoxes of Robert Redford's early life is this. He was taught to be strong, in a home where strength was misunderstood. To his parents, strength meant holding everything together, never wavering, never breaking, never admitting you were hurting. They believed silence protected the family. They believed composure was kindness. But to a child, silence feels like distance. And composure feels like coldness. Robert learned early how to carry things alone, how to keep big emotions hidden, how to smile even when he didn't feel like it, how to be the good son, the healthy son, the surviving son. He became good at it, too good. And that created a subtle fracture inside him. One that wouldn't be visible until much later. But even in the quietest homes, shadows have edges, and edges eventually begin to sharpen. Some children speak to be heard, others observe to understand. Robert was the second kind. He watched the way neighbors talked with one another at block parties. He watched the way men interacted with their wives, some gentle, some distant, some hardened by their own quiet battles. He watched the world unfold like a play with characters he didn't always understand but never stopped studying. He became an expert in expressions, how people said one thing but meant another, how smiles could hide sadness, how stillness could hide fear. He didn't know it then, but he was already training to become the kind of actor who doesn't perform loudly, he performs truthfully. Redford's characters would one day be famous for their subtlety, for the emotions simmering beneath calm surfaces, for the way his eyes could express what dialogue never said. Those skills weren't learned on a stage. They were learned in the quiet living room of his childhood home, watching parents who whispered their pain through gestures instead of words. In a home where talking about emotions felt dangerous, young Robert found sanctuary elsewhere. Art, drawing, daydreaming. He filled notebooks with rough sketches, landscapes, faces, shapes he didn't yet understand. His mother encouraged it quietly, glad to see him express what no one in the house dared to say out loud. Art became a private language, a place where he could translate feelings into lines and colors. He was good at it too, so good that teachers remarked on it. So good that he began to imagine, even faintly, a life where creativity might matter. Sports gave him escape. Art gave him expression. But something was still missing. A direction, a calling, a way out. The shadows at home didn't define him, but they shaped him. And as he got older, the desire to run transformed into a desire to grow. But first, he had to face one more reality. Even the brightest children sometimes take dangerous detours. There's a moment in every young person's life when the weight of childhood begins to crack open, revealing both gifts and scars. For Robert Redford, that moment came quietly, without drama, without spectacle. It came in the slow accumulation of experiences. The illness that taught him fragility, the losses that taught him silence, the restlessness that taught him motion, the parents who taught him love mixed with fear. None of these experiences were loud, but they were loud inside him. The boy who learned not to burden others would become the teenager who kept too much to himself. The boy who felt responsible for surviving would become the young man who questioned his own worth. The boy who learned to outrun grief would become the adult who chased meaning in distant places. His later struggles, academic missteps, drinking too much in college, aimlessness, didn't happen in a vacuum. They were rooted in the soil of his youth. And yet, those same shadows that made life difficult also gave him something invaluable. A deep, intuitive understanding of the human condition. Without those early hardships, he might have become just another sunny California athlete, talented but one-dimensional. Instead, he became a man capable of portraying complexity, vulnerability, and quiet interior conflict, qualities that would define some of the most iconic performances in American film history. But all of that came later. For now, he was still just a boy in California, learning the rules of a world that felt too big and too fragile all at once. People often assume that greatness begins with talent, but in Robert Redford's case, greatness began with contradiction. He was gifted but insecure, energetic but emotionally burdened, curious but unsure where curiosity might lead, loved but shaped by loss. Those contradictions created tension, and tension creates growth. The early shadows didn't break him, they forged him. The illness made him appreciate health. The losses made him value connection. The silence made him listen deeply. The restlessness made him seek adventure. The parental caution made him fiercely independent. Every piece of his childhood, every joy, every ache, created a man who would one day step onto the world's stage not as a stereotype, but as a fully formed, deeply layered human being. And that, perhaps more than anything, is why audiences connected to him so profoundly. His performances felt real because they came from somewhere real, somewhere formed decades earlier in the quiet rooms of his California home. This is where the story begins, not with fame but with fragility. Not with success but with shadows. Not with applause but with silence. Before Robert Redford became a cinematic icon, he was a boy shaped by grief, resilience, curiosity, and a desire to find a voice in a world that often asked him to be quiet. As the 1950s unfolded, the restless kid from Santa Monica was quickly becoming something else, an undeniable athletic force. By the time he hit high school, Robert Redford wasn't just participating in sports, he was dominating them. Baseball, football, track, every field he stepped on, he left a mark. Coaches talked about him like he was touched by something rare: speed, agility, instinct, a competitive fire that burned hot but quiet. He wasn't the loudest kid on the team. He wasn't the showboat. He played the way he lived, with determination that came from someplace deeper. He ran like someone who'd spent his childhood learning to outrun shadows. He competed like someone who didn't know how to quit. And college scouts noticed. When the University of Colorado offered him a baseball scholarship, it felt like fate had finally rewarded him. After illness, after childhood loss, after quiet griefs that had shaped him more than anyone knew. He was 18. He was talented. He was on the brink of something extraordinary. Life, for the first time, seemed to be aligning in his favor. But fate is rarely predictable. And just when he stepped onto what looked like a clear path, the ground disappeared beneath him. Before tragedy enters the story, we must understand who was lost. Martha Hart Redford was not a celebrity, not a public figure, not someone history books write pages about. But to Robert, she was everything gentle in a world that often felt sharp. She was the fire that warmed the rooms of the house. She was the person who noticed his drawings, his imagination, the spark of creativity he didn't yet understand. She saw the artistic soul inside the athlete, and she nurtured it quietly. While his father emphasized discipline, practicality, and perseverance, Martha encouraged curiosity, expression, softness. She wasn't pushing him toward Hollywood, she simply believed in the part of him that most people overlooked, the dreamer. She was the balance to the silence of the home. She was the person who softened the unspoken griefs. She was the voice that said, "You can be more than one thing." And that mattered. Because Robert Redford was more than one thing, even then, even before he knew what he wanted, his mother saw it long before he did. So when she fell ill, it struck like lightning. There was no warnings, no slow decline, no time to prepare. A sudden bloodstream infection, swift, brutal, irreversible, took her life in a matter of days. Robert was 18, and in an instant, the center of his world disappeared. Grief at 18 is different than grief at any other age. A child loses a mother and the world becomes unfamiliar. An adult loses a mother and the world becomes emptier. A teenager loses a mother and the world stops making sense altogether. For Redford, Martha's death was not just a loss, it was an emotional earthquake. This was the woman who had protected him from the silence of the household, the person who helped him believe his imagination mattered, the one who encouraged him to draw, to explore, to think beyond what others expected. And suddenly, she was gone. No warnings, no explanation that made sense, no goodbye he felt ready for. The grief did not simply break him. It cracked the foundation he had been building his life on. The scholarship, the sports, the expectations, the potential, they all suddenly felt small, irrelevant, hollow. He had spent his childhood learning to carry pain quietly. Now he carried this loss the same way, internally, privately, dangerously. When Robert Redford arrived at the University of Colorado, he wasn't the same young man who had earned the scholarship. His friends from home described him as changed, not angrier, not colder, just lost. His grades slipped first, then his focus, then his discipline. College requires grounding, and Redford had none left. The routines he once excelled in, the practices, the drills, the structure, felt impossible to maintain. And then came the drinking. At first, it was the way many young people drink, casually, socially, thoughtlessly. But grief changes the nature of excess. It wasn't about fun, it was about escape. Alcohol softened the edges of his pain. It numbed the questions he couldn't answer. It filled the silence his mother's absence left behind. But it also clouded the direction he had once run toward with such fire. The scholarship that had once felt like destiny began slipping through his fingers. He missed classes, missed practices, missed chances. His coaches grew concerned. His professors noticed the downward spiral. And he simply let himself fall. Not because he didn't care, but because caring hurt too much. When young people lose their way, it often happens quietly. Not in dramatic breakdowns or public collapses, but in small, steady steps away from who they used to be. That was Robert Redford. Drifting, untethered, hurt in ways he didn't know how to articulate. Some people fall once. Robert had fallen twice before adulthood. And yet his story didn't end here. In interviews many years later, Redford would speak rarely about this period, but when he did, his words carried weight. He described feeling like he had no purpose, no direction, that the world had lost color, that he wasn't sure who he was without his mother's presence to anchor him. The boy who had been unstoppable on baseball fields now struggled to get out of bed for morning classes. The athlete who had once soared lost faith in his own potential. The dreamer his mother had raised went quiet. He wasn't just grieving. He was unraveling. And the world around him didn't know what to do with that kind of pain. Nobody taught young men, especially athletes, how to talk about their feelings in the 1950s. And he had learned his whole life to hide his emotions, to be strong, to perform stability. The idea of asking for help was unimaginable. So he did what many young people do when the world becomes too heavy. He ran, but this time running didn't save him. Running cost him the very future he had worked for. Eventually, he lost his scholarship. Not because he lacked talents, but because grief had stolen the fire that once drove him. The fall was complete. The dream was gone. The boy who had been destined for athletic greatness was now without direction. Sometimes, life must strip someone clean before it can rebuild them into what they were meant to become. That was the paradox of this chapter in Redford's life. The collapse that seemed like the end was actually the beginning. But he couldn't see that yet. He left Colorado not with triumph but with shame. He wasn't angry at the world, he was disappointed in himself. He felt he had let down his coaches, his peers, his father, and perhaps most painfully, his mother's memory. He stood at a crossroads with no map, no identity, and no clear path forward. The dreams he inherited from his father, success through discipline and stability, were gone. The dreams his mother had quietly nurtured, creativity, imagination, exploration, had not yet awakened. He was a young man with no direction, and yet too much pain to stand still. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept moving. Even though he was lost, there was one thing grief couldn't touch: his inner restlessness. It had been with him since childhood, fueling his curiosity, his risks, his refusal to stay inside the lines drawn for him. That same restlessness now became both his burden and his salvation. He drifted, not aimlessly, but searching for something he couldn't name. He worked odd jobs. He traveled. He drank too much, but he also began to watch the world more closely. Something inside him was shifting. Pain can destroy a person, but it can also deepen them. And in Redford's case, the very shadows that threatened to consume him were quietly shaping him into the man he would become. Someone capable of portraying complexity, silence, struggle, vulnerability. Someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still believe in something more. If Robert Redford had stayed on the athletic path, he might have become a good player, maybe even a great one. But he wouldn't have become Robert Redford. His mother's death, though devastating, created a turning point that pushed him into the unknown. It broke him, yes, but it also freed him from a future that wasn't truly his. The collapse of his scholarship forced him into the world in a way that no young athlete expects. Without baseball to hold onto, without academic success to fall back on, he began to look inward for the first time in his life. The drawing he used to do as a kid. The quiet artistic spark his mother had seen. The part of him that felt out of place on a baseball field, but alive when exploring new places. Those pieces were still there, waiting for him, buried under grief but not forgotten. His mother had known he possessed a creative soul. Her absence didn't extinguish that soul. It amplified its urgency. In losing her, he was forced to confront the question she had recognized long before he did. Who are you really beneath the expectations? That question would propel him to Paris. To art, to discovery, to acting, to the extraordinary career that followed. But that's later. Right now, he was still the young man walking through the ashes of tragedy, not yet knowing he was standing on the threshold of a new beginning. People often talk about success as if it begins the moment someone finds their talent. But for Robert Redford, success began in the moment he lost everything. The collapse at the University of Colorado. The drinking, the academic failure, the shattered identity was not the end. It was the clearing of the paths. His second fall this fall was the one that forced him to rebuild from zero. And when you build from zero, you get to choose the materials. He could have chosen bitterness. He could have chosen anger. He could have chosen a small life in a quiet town, hiding from the pain. But he didn't. Something in him, something instinctive, restless, resilient, refused to give up. He didn't know what the future held, but he wasn't ready to stop searching for it. And that resilience, raw and untrained, was the spark that saved him. At 18, with his mother gone, his scholarship lost, and his identity shattered, Robert Redford stood at an emotional cliff. He wasn't a star. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't even a promising student anymore. He was simply a young man, trying to understand who he was without the person who had believed in him most. But sometimes the cliff is not a dead end. Sometimes it's a doorway. And in the space created by loss, a new version of Robert Redford began to form. A deeper one, a more complex one capable of carrying the emotional weight he would later pour into his art. This was the beginning of his rebirth, even if he couldn't see it yet. When Robert Redford left college, he wasn't leaving behind a campus. He was leaving behind a version of himself he could no longer carry. The grief of losing his mother still sat heavy on his chest. The shame of failing out of school clung to him like a shadow. He felt hollow, directionless, restless. A young man with too many emotions and no place to put them. So he did what young men have done for centuries. When their world becomes too small to breathe in, he ran toward the horizons, not in rebellions, not in angers, but in search. Europe offered distance, mystery, anonymity. A place where nobody knew him as the athlete who fell from grace. The boy who broke under loss. The young man who didn't know who he was supposed to be. He had no grand plans, no clear dreams, just a backpack, a battered sketchbook, and a fragile hope that there might be something out there, waiting to awaken the parts of him he'd buried. The world expected him to come home eventually and return to a sensible life. But Robert Redford wasn't looking for sense. He was looking for meaning. Paris in the late 1950s was not the polished postcard it is today. It pulsed with a beautiful, imperfect energy. A city full of cigarette smoke curling out of cafe doorways, of jazz drifting from basement clubs, of young artists painting on sidewalks, while philosophers debated over cheap wine. For the first time in years, Redford didn't feel watched. He didn't feel judged. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't a disappointment. He wasn't the son who had survived, or the teenager who had lost control. He was simply Bobby, a quiet American with hungry eyes, sketching faces, rooftops, and passing strangers, as if capturing pieces of the world would help him rebuild his own. Days bled into nights. Nights blended into a rhythm of conversations that lasted until sunrise. He lived frugally, sometimes too frugally. He slept in cheap rooms, ate from street vendors, and spent whatever spare coins he had on pencils, paper, and paint. But he was alive, more alive than he had ever felt in Colorado. Paris didn't judge his pain. It let him feel it. It let him explore it. It let him transform it. He learned something there, something subtle but life-altering. Art wasn't a hobby. It was a way of breathing. From Paris, Redford drifted south, following a pull he couldn't name, across train tracks that cut through mountains, to a place where art lived not in museums, but in the very stones of the city. Florence. If Paris taught him to feel, Florence taught him to focus. The Renaissance masters Michelangelo, Botticelli, Da Vinci were everywhere. Their influence was unavoidable, their brilliance inescapable. Redford enrolled in art classes, sometimes officially, sometimes by simply sitting near the window and sketching silently while others painted. He learned discipline, detail, patience. In Colorado, those qualities had been demanded of him physically. In Florence, they were demanded of him emotionally. He discovered that grief has texture, loneliness has shape, memory has color. He poured all of it onto canvases, not beautifully at first, but truthfully, and through the act of creating, he discovered something profound. He didn't want to be an athlete. He didn't want a typical life. He didn't want to fit into the mold others expected. He wanted to express. He needed to express. Europe wasn't an escape anymore. It was an awakening. When he eventually returned to the United States, his father expected a son ready to rebuild his life traditionally. School, job, structure. But Robert had changed. He didn't come back with medals or degrees. He came back with art and a new hunger. The stage began calling to him. A place where emotion wasn't weakness, where silence carried meaning, where pain could be transformed into storytelling. He began studying acting in New York. Not casually, not experimentally, but with the same intensity that once drove him across baseball fields. Acting wasn't a performance for him. It was a release, a way to pour out everything he'd stored inside. Over a lifetime of loss and unspoken grief, when he stepped onto a stage, he wasn't pretending. He was letting himself feel, in a way he'd never been allowed to at home. The first steps onto a Broadway stage are rarely glamorous. Small theaters, small roles, small audiences. But for Redford, each night felt like standing at the edge of an emotional cliff, and finally finding the courage to leap. Tall Story, Little Moon of Albans. These weren't just plays. They were mirrors. When he played young soldiers, he revisited the fragility he learned from childhood illness. When he played conflicted young men, he poured in the confusion of losing his mother. When he portrayed characters searching for themselves, he wasn't acting. He was revealing, piece by piece, layer by layers. Audiences saw sincerity. Directors saw depth. Fellow actors saw commitment. But nobody understood just how desperately he needed the stage to keep himself standing upright. He had found his calling, not because he sought applause, but because it allowed him to finally speak the language his life had forced him to learn silently. Offstage, life offered him something unexpected. Love. He married Lola Van Wagenens, a smart, thoughtful, grounded woman who believed in him before Hollywood ever would. Together they welcomed their first child, Scott. For a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like the universe had decided to give back what it had taken. Redford held his son and felt a kind of hope he hadn't felt since childhood. He felt the return of warmth, of possibility, of a future he could shape with his own hands. He was only 21, but he felt older, shaped by hardship, softened by art, reborn by fatherhood. This was the chapter that should have healed him, the one that should have rewritten his story, from one of loss to one of new beginnings. But fate had one more cruel turn, and it came without warnings. Scott Redford was only a few months old when the unimaginable happened. No illnesses, no long declines, just a sudden passing in the night. A tragedy that medical science would later call sudden infant death syndrome. There are no words that can soften the blow of a loss like that. Robert and Lola were shattered. Their world became quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, not peaceful. And for the second time in his life, Robert Redford stood over a future that had vanished without explanation. He was 21 years old, a new father, a new actor, a grieving parent for the second time in his family line. His childhood had taught him that grief was carried in silence. But this grief was different. It was too large to hide, too powerful to ignore, too devastating to outrun. And yet, he didn't collapse. He came close, but he didn't fall. Why? Because he had finally found something that could hold his emotions safely. The craft. After Scott's death, Redford walked back onto stages with a heaviness that audiences could not name, but could undeniably feel. Everything changed. His performances deepened, not theatrically, but truthfully. He no longer used acting to escape his emotions. He used it to survive them. Every character became a container for what he couldn't express in words. Grief, confusion, anger, love, fear, hope. He wasn't performing from the outside in. He was performing from the inside out. Broadway directors noticed. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. But none of them knew what he was truly carrying. This period didn't make him a great actor. It made him a human actor. An artist whose strength came not from technique, But from honesty, the boy who had once defined himself as a restless athlete was gone, the young man who lost his mother before he learned how to understand her was evolving. The new father, who held grief in both hands, was becoming someone different. Not broken, but reshaped. Loss did not harden Robert Redford. It deepened him. He understood suffering. He understood silence. He understood the fragility of life in a way that would later echo through nearly every character he played. His emotional vocabulary expanded. His artistic courage grew. His resilience, though forged painfully, became unshakable. He was no longer a young man searching for an identity. He was an artist, building one. When people talk about Robert Redford's rise, they often begin with Hollywood, with films, fame, and Sundance. But the truth is, the legend began here, in the cafes of Paris, in the studios of Florence, in the dimly lit rehearsal rooms of New York, in the grief he survived, in the art he embraced, in the roles that became therapy, in the pain that became purpose. This chapter, this rebirth in art, was not glamorous, not triumphant, not cinematic in the traditional sense. It was quiet, messy, vulnerable, human, and from that humanity emerged a strength that audiences around the world would one day feel on screen, without ever knowing why. Robert Redford's artistry was not born from privilege, or ease, or luck. It was born from survival, from transformation, from the courage to turn toward pain. Instead of running from it, he didn't just become an actor. He became an artist forged by life's harshest lessons and softened by the one thing that always saved him: expression. This was the true beginning of the man the world would one day celebrate. By the time the 1960s turned into the 1970s, Robert Redford had become more than an actor. He had become a phenomenon. Barefoot in the Park, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Jeremiah Johnson, The Way We Were, The Sting, All the President's Men. Film after film, audiences fell in love with the sandy-haired star, whose smile carried warmth, whose eyes carried calm, and whose presence carried a rare, effortless charisma. He was the kind of actor who didn't need to raise his voice to dominate a scene. Quiet intensity, steady confidence, unshakable charm. To Hollywood, he was golden. To audiences, he was magnetic. To the world, he seemed untouchable. But the truth was far more complicated. Inside, Redford carried a story that didn't match the man on magazine covers. Behind the quiet strengths was a reservoir of losses: childhood illness, siblings he never got to know, the mother he adored, the infant son he would grieve for the rest of his life. These scars never fully healed. They were part of him, shaping him, fueling him, anchoring him. Hollywood adored the mask, but Redford's art was born from the wound beneath it. People often assume that great acting comes from skill alone, from technique, training, rehearsal. But for Robert Redford, performance was something deeper, almost spiritual. He didn't act from the outside in. He acted from the inside out, from a place carved by experiences he rarely spoke about. On screen, he was composed, but inside he carried the silence of his childhood home, the ache of losing his mother at 18, the devastation of losing his first child, the feeling of never being able to say goodbye in the ways he needed to. And yet he didn't wear his pain visibly. He let it shape him quietly, like a river shaping stone. This invisible thread ran through his performances: the haunted steadiness of Jeremiah Johnson, The righteous fury of all the president's men. The wistful longing of the way we were. The wounded innocence of the Great Gatsby. But none of those films allowed him to fully explore the pain that had shaped his life. That story would arrive in 1980s, when the novel Ordinary People was released. Redford read it the way some people read a diary, with recognition, with discomfort, with an ache. That felt almost too personal. It wasn't the plot that pulled him in. It was the truth inside it. A family splintered by loss. A grief that isolates. A father searching for connection. A mother hiding her pain behind composure. A son drowning in guilt and unable to express it. Redford knew those emotional landscapes better than he wished he did. He had lived in a home where pain went unspoken. He knew the weight of grief that changes a family's shape. He knew what it meant to suffer quietly, invisibly, because you don't want to burden the people you love. Ordinary People wasn't just a story he admired. It was a story that reflected him. Directing it wasn't a career choice. It was an act of reckoning. By 1980, Redford was one of the biggest stars in the world. He could have chosen any film to direct. A blockbuster, an adventure, something safer. Instead, he chose a quiet story about the kind of hurts most people don't talk about. Executives pushed back immediately. It's too dark. It's too quiet. It's not commercial. Why this story? Why now? But Redford didn't flinch. He knew darkness intimately. He knew that silence could be honest. He knew that grief could be cinematic, if handled with truth instead of spectacle. He didn't want glamours. He wanted authenticity. He didn't want melodramas. He wanted humanities. He didn't want people to watch characters cry. He wanted them to recognize themselves. Hollywood didn't understand his resolve, but it didn't matter. Robert Redford had spent his entire life learning how to trust the quiet voice inside him. This time he followed it. Filmmaking is often loud. Sets full of lights, noise, chatter, chaos. But the set of Ordinary People was different. Redford built an environment where silence wasn't feared. It was respected. He encouraged actors to sit with their emotions instead of performing them. He asked them to feel the scenes rather than act them. He guided them gently, with empathy and patience, never forcing moments, never pushing for tears. He wasn't chasing dramatic peaks. He was chasing authenticity. The kind of authenticity that can only come from experience. His actors trusted him. Audiences would later feel that trust. In every frame, Redford guided the performances with the sensitivity of someone who had lived inside the story's emotional truth. He wasn't just directing a film. He was translating the language of his own past. Why did Ordinary People resonate so deeply with him? Because its themes were echoes of his own life. Redford's father had done this after losing his daughters. A strength through silence, the only way he knew how to survive. As a child of loss, Robert had lived with an unspoken burden, a quiet pressure to be fine, so others wouldn't hurt more. He understood how grief could spread through a house without anyone acknowledging it. His upbringing had taught him that pain stayed beneath the surface. Some wounds, he knew, don't simply disappear with time. They have to be faced. In the story, in the characters, in the silences between them. Redford saw reflections of people he loved, and versions of himself he had never been able to articulate. When Ordinary People was released, Hollywood didn't just take notice. It stood still. Critics praised its precision, its emotional honesty, its quiet power. It wasn't loud, but it was devastating. It wasn't sensational, but it was unforgettable. It was the kind of film that whispers instead of shouts, and still hits harder than any explosion. Audiences felt seen. Parents, children, families recognized themselves in the tension, the misunderstanding, the grief that sat between the characters. Like a ghost, the film didn't glamorize pain. It respected it. It didn't offer easy answers. It offered truths, and truth always resonates. At the Academy Awards, Ordinary People won Best Picture. Robert Redford won Best Director. Hollywood celebrated him as a newly crowned filmmaking force, a man who could have a career behind the camera, as legendary as his career in front of it. The applause was loud. The stage lights were blinding. The praise was overflowing. But for Redford, the victory was quiet, personal, private, almost solemn. To the world, it was a triumph. To him, it was something gentler, a confirmation that the quiet truths of his life had found a place to be heard. After the Oscars, people assumed he would revisit the movie that had changed his career. But he didn't. Not once. It belongs to the public now, he said. But those words hid another truth, a more fragile one. Some stories reopen wounds. Some stories ask you to look too directly at the parts of yourself you've worked hard to heal. Ordinary People wasn't just a film he made. It was a film he survived. Watching it again would mean returning to rooms he had already walked through, with trembling steps. Some pain does not need a second viewing. After Ordinary People, Hollywood saw Redford differently. He was no longer just the handsome leading man or the golden star of American cinema. He was a storyteller, with insight, with bravery, with emotional intelligence, rarely seen in filmmakers of his generation. But what the world didn't know was that Ordinary People wasn't just the story of a fictional family. It was the story of grief and the cost of silence. It was the story of emotional distance, parental pressure, unspoken love, and the complicated shape that mourning can take. It was, in many ways, a reflection of his life. Creating it didn't heal him completely. Nothing could, but it did give shape to feelings he had held inside for years. And in that act of shaping, he discovered something new. That art could be more than expression. It could be transformation. Redford's journey, from a grief-stricken teenager to one of the most important storytellers of his generation, is not a simple arc of success. It is a story of loss, turned into empathy, silence turned into expression, deep wounds turned into creative fuel. He didn't make Ordinary People for fame, or awards, or legacy. He made it because he saw himself in it. He made it because art had saved him when nothing else could. He made it to honor the people he lost and the emotions he carried. He made it because telling the truth was the only way forward. This was not just the work of a filmmaker. It was the work of a man who had learned that even the deepest pains can become a form of purpose. At the height of Redford's fame, when studios fought to cast him, and audiences packed theaters just to watch him breathe on screen, there was a truth he repeated quietly, consistently, almost stubbornly. My life belongs to my family. Only the performance belongs to the public. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a media lines. It was his compass. To understand the gravity of that statement, you have to go back into the core of his past. A past shaped not by fame, but by the fragile experiences that taught him how precious a family can be. Losing his mother at 18, losing his first child at 21, carrying memories of the infant sisters he never knew. Those heartbreaks didn't fade. They became permanent threads in his emotional fabric. So when life finally gave him the chance to build a family of his own, there was no part of him, absolutely none, that took it for granted. Fame was bright, but family was sacred. That belief became his anchor, his shield, and his private religion, in a world that constantly tried to pull him away. The early 1980s were a defining time for Redford professionally. He had just won the Academy Award for directing Ordinary People. He was filming The Natural, a movie many believed would cement his status as one of America's most beloved leading men. On screen, he looked unstoppable, the embodiment of resilience, a mythic figure rising from difficulty to reclaim greatness. But off-screen, life was more complicated. He had 4 children, Shauna, Amy, Jamie, and James, each with their own paths, their own dreams, their own struggles. Redford understood something that many celebrities often learn too late. Success can be rebuilt. Careers can recover. But a child only gets one father. So he made a promise to himself that no matter how loud the world became, no matter how demanding the industry was, his home would never be secondary. And then tragedy tested that promise. During the filming of The Natural, an event hit the Redford family with the kind of force that stops time itself. Shauna Redford, his eldest daughter, had been in a loving relationship with a young man named Sid Wells. He was kind, respectful, a steady presence in her life. And then suddenly, he was gone. The loss stunned her. It stunned the family. It stunned Redford. He was in the middle of filming. Long days, heavy scenes. A performance the studio depended on. But the moment he heard what happened, the cameras, the lights, the schedule, none of it mattered. He walked off the set. No hesitation. No negotiations. No consideration of the impact on the production. His daughter needed him. That was the only truth that existed. For days or weeks, he stood by her side. In a moment so devastating that words were nearly useless. He protected her privacy. He shielded her from the press. He sat with her through the silence that follows sudden tragedy. He didn't try to fix the unfixable. He simply stayed. And sometimes, staying is the most powerful act of love a parent can offer. Many stories of Hollywood parents are filled with distance, with careers overshadowing childhoods, with fame taking priority. Redford was the opposite. He refused to let his profession take precedence over his humanity. He went to school events quietly, without fanfare. He attended sports games, encouraged hobbies, kept the family home, away from the prying eyes of photographers and gossip columns. He raised his children to value kindness over attention, substance over celebrity, and he raised them with the humility of a man who had known loss more intimately than most people ever will. Shauna's heartbreak in 1983 was a brutal reminder of how delicate life can be, but it was also a moment that revealed Redford's true identity. He was a protector long before he was a performer. As the 1990s unfolded, Redford's public life was flourishing. He was directing major films, expanding the Sundance Institute, and becoming one of the most influential figures in independent cinema. But at home, another storm was gathering. His son James, known to the family as Jamie, began experiencing serious health issues. Doctors diagnosed him with a rare liver disease that threatened his life. The news hit Redford with a familiar, unbearable ache. He had already lost one child. He had already watched others go through unthinkable pain. Now he was faced with the possibility that he might lose another. He didn't crumble. He didn't panic. He didn't retreat. He anchored himself exactly where he was needed. By his son's side, hospital rooms replaced film sets. Medical charts replaced scripts. Waiting rooms replaced award shows. There were long nights, filled with uncertainty, questions without answers, and the quiet, suffocating fear that no parent ever fully escapes. And then came the needs. For not one, but 2 liver transplants. Redford stayed for all of it. Every appointment, every treatment, every moment. Not as a celebrity, not as an icon, as a dad. Serious illness does more than weaken the body. It can weaken the spirit. It can make even the strongest people lose their sense of purpose. Redford understood this. He recognized the danger of despair creeping in during long medical recoveries. So he did something beautiful. Quiet, simple, supportive. He offered Jamie a writing job. A real job. Meaningful work. A creative lifeline. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was belief. A father telling his son, "You still have a voice. You still matter. Your story is not over." And it worked. Jamie regained strength. He found direction. He began writing documentaries that focused on hope, on resilience, on environmental issues that aligned with his father's values. Eventually, he built a career of his own, one that connected deeply to the same principles Redford had lived by. They worked together on multiple projects, not just as father and son, but as collaborators, as artists, as men trying to use their work to make the world a little better. The illness had taken so much, but it had given them something too, a shared purpose. By 2020, the world saw Robert Redford as a symbol of strength, a man who had weathered every storm with dignity. But that year, another tragedy arrived. After decades of complications related to his earlier conditions, Jamie passed away. The news broke quietly, without spectacle, just as the Redford family always preferred. For Robert, the heartbreak was unimaginable. He had lost a child before, a pain that never fully leaves. But losing an adult child, one he had worked alongside, laughed with, created with, and watched grow into a man who inspired others. That kind of loss is not just heartbreaking, it is life-altering. And yet again, as he had done throughout his life, Redford grieved privately. He carried the loss with quiet reverence, never exploiting it, never using it for public sympathy. He protected Jamie's memory the same way he protected every person he loved, with silence, with grace, with depth, throughout all of these tragedies. Through every loss, every hospital room, every impossible phone call, one truth remained. Redford never let fame pull him away from the people he loved. He didn't build a life that revolved around Hollywood. He built one that revolved around connection. His home in Utah was not just a retreat from the cameras. It was a sanctuary for his children, a place of safety, creativity, and groundings. He raised them to be thoughtful, independent thinkers, not people controlled by his reputation. And as they grew, they became reflections of the values he lived: integrity, resilience, thoughtfulness, empathy. These were the real legacies he cared about. Movies fade, but children carry you forward in ways the world never fully sees. People often ask, why Robert Redford never embraced the Hollywood lifestyle? Why he avoided the parties, the spotlight, the attention? The answer is simple. He knew how fragile life is. He learned it as a child. He learned it as a young man. He learned it as a father. When you have buried your mothers, before you become an adult, when you have lost a child, before you can fully understand parenthood, when you have nearly lost another, to illnesses, you do not take people for granted. You do not chase fame at the expense of time with the people who matters. You do not sacrifice love for legacy. For Redford, family was not a responsibility. It was a guiding principle. The one thing he could not bear to fail at. As he once said, fame is fleeting, family is permanent. Even though Redford guarded his family fiercely, his devotion became a quiet lesson for millions watching from afar. He showed that success does not have to come at the cost of personal relationships. He showed that strength does not come from hiding pain, but from carrying it with compassion. He showed that parenthood is not measured by perfection, but by presence. He showed that a man, deeply shaped by loss, can still build a life rooted in love. And he showed something else, perhaps the most important truth of all. The world may celebrate your achievements, but your children will remember your kindness. When Robert Redford appeared on screen, something almost paradoxical happened. He could deliver a line with absolute stillness, and yet it vibrated with emotion. He could glance downward, barely a movement, and audiences felt entire worlds shifting beneath the surface. Critics tried to explain it. Writers described it as understatement, minimalism, restraint, but none of those words captured the truth. Behind the eyes that had seen too much, too early, Redford acted the way emotionally wounded people breathe. Deeply, carefully, as if protecting a bruise the world can't see. You didn't watch his characters. You felt them. The loneliness of the Great Gatsby. The internal struggle of 3 Days of the Condor. The broken hope of The Way We Were. The shaken morality in All the President's Men. The searching soul of Jeremiah Johnson. These performances weren't constructed. They were released. They were the language of a man who had learned to express what others hide. Some people collapse beneath sorrow. Some become hardened, cynical, impenetrable. But Redford became something rare. Someone whose inner pain sharpened his empathy. Rather than crushing it, every loss filled him with a deeper urge to understand humanity. Not to flee from it, not to numb it, but to study it, to carry it, and later, to portray it. He once said in an interview, "My life has been shaped by what was taken from me. But the miraculous thing is what he did with those empty spaces. He turned them into art that healed others. Because there is a certain kind of performance, the kind that doesn't just entertain, but reflects the audience back to themselves. That can only come from someone who knows grief intimately." Redford became that performer, that storyteller, that artist, and the revelation is this: tragedy did not close him. It opened him. There's a rare type of strength that doesn't appear on magazine covers. It doesn't roar or grandstand. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It's the strength of people who keep showing up after heartbreak. People who speak softly because life has taught them noise doesn't solve anything. People who listen deeply because they know silence is full of meaning. Redford embodied that strength in everything he did. He wasn't a loud star. He wasn't a tabloid figure. He was both present and private. Reserved but never distant. Humble but never small. And yet there was always something in him. A slight pause, A searching glance, a hesitation before a smile. That told the audience, this man understood life. At a cellular level, his characters often carried wounds. They didn't discuss. So did he. His characters often searched for connection. In a world built to separate people. So did he. His characters often wrestled with regret, responsibility, the weight of the past. And so did he. It wasn't imitation. It was sharing. It was sharing. It was sharing. It was sharing. It was sharing.